Well, thank you so much, Marina. Hi, everyone. So thank you for joining us today. Like Marina said, my name is Carrie Hart, and I'm actually filling in for Donna Marshall. Some of you may have experienced Donna on our last webinar when she rolled out the information on Bill 132. So Donna's had to be pulled away on a tiny little emergency, nothing too serious, but so I'm happy to fill in. And I'm the VP of Training and Development at BizLife. So we're a division of Work-Life Solutions. And just to give you a quick snapshot, we are an employee development and training company, and really our emphasis is on creating psychological safety and wellness in the workplace. We've spent essentially over a decade promoting zero tolerance. So it's really exciting for our team here, who really, this is a labor of love and a movement for us that's been long since happening. It's really exciting that our government is starting to catch on and really dial into how serious this issue is. And Dr. Stephanie Bott and Donna Marshall, who are the principals at BizLife Solutions and WorkRight, were instrumental in presenting and informing the changes in the legislation with their consultation to Kevin Flynn, who's our Minister of Labor. So we're very proud of the fact that our voice was heard on this legislation. And it's really through that experience that we've arrived here, and we'd really like to pass that knowledge on to you. And we're going to do that in the way of answering your questions, specifically around Bill 132 and harassment in general. So I want to say welcome back to anybody that was on the previous webinar, and also a warm welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. Since our last webinar, there's been overwhelming questions, and that's really why we approached Charity Village in the first place, to say, hey, you know, maybe we better put ourselves back out there just in case, because I think a lot of people are lagging in terms of getting this implementation done, and maybe around you know, the certainty of having the knowledge to put this in place. So I'm going to spend about 15 minutes on each layer of the legislation and hopefully leave some time at the end for some general questions. So in between each layer, which there are 3 of, we'll be taking questions, and that's broken into 3 things. So I'm going to get started because I want to spend as much time doing that as possible. So just to give you a quick recap, effective September 8th, 2016, our government requires Ontario-based organizations to be compliant with Bill 132, and that's essentially your sexual violence in the workplace. It's an amendment to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Violence and Harassment in the Workplace, previously known as Bill 168. So there are 3 compliance requirements, and I think probably most people know this by now, but it's important to point out the first thing is you have to have a policy. The second thing is, which is very new, is a written program. And the third thing is your employees need to be trained. So I'll do a quick review of the legislation for each section and then open it up to questions. So the Ontario Health and Safety Act has a 2-part definition of harassment. And although very boring for everybody, I am going to read it for the sake of those auditory learners. Engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace that is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome, or engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace because of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, where the course of comment or conduct is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome, or making a sexual solicitation or advance where the person making the solicitation or advance is in a position to confer, grant, or deny a benefit or advancement to the worker, and the person knows or ought reasonably to know that the solicitation or advance is unwelcome. So that's going to move us on to our policies. So I'm just going to jump back here. Essentially we've had an overwhelming question, and that's really, you know, the MOL states that you only need 1 policy for violence. Why does BIS recommend separating these policies? And the reason I put this question out there without polling the audience for that information is because almost every client that we worked with returned this question to us. So I thought I would sort of broad stroke it quickly, answer that, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So while meeting with while you'll be meeting the legislation requirements to have 1 policy, it isn't the best way, and keeping in mind that our value as a business is beyond the legislation. We like to see people compliant, but that does not create psychological health and safety in the workplace. The compliance is a government engine that is catching up to what we really need. However, it's important to understand what really does influence the culture at a high level. So the best way to implement this legislation is to break out the policies the way that we've suggested. And it's much easier for the employer and employees if we break them out into two, one for violence, one for harassment, because the definitions are significantly different and the requirements for addressing harassment have changed under Bill 132. So we just find it easier to have two policies. And we have templates for both policies. And one of the things that we've found in terms of the terminology vexatious, that has presented a tremendous amount of conflict for people because of, we don't know really what that means. So without getting into that, because we don't have a lot of time and I want to spend the time with you, we essentially, harassment is in the eye of the person receiving it versus the person who's giving it. So that's really the place where we all have to reside and understand and interpret the experience, is that it's not necessarily if somebody's hugging their employees because they're excited for them and their intent is just to show appreciation. It's often maybe not received in the way it's intended, and it's actually the person receiving the gesture where the harassment is defined. So I'm just going to go ahead and speak to the audience, and if you have any questions around policies, now would be the time to let us know. Go ahead.
Great, thanks, Carrie. So I think we'll start with our very first question. You were talking about having different policies. Can you talk a bit more about why it's necessary to have separate policies for workplace violence, harassment, and sexual harassment, as opposed to having it encompassed in one?
Okay, so that's an excellent question, Marina. Thank you. And I think it's something that, it's important for people to understand. Again, the legislation is essentially designed to check boxes. And it's with no disrespect that I say that. It just hasn't caught up to what people really need to feel safe. So the first line of safety would be to really help people understand the definitions of what each and every, what they're saying in the legislation. So the recommendation to split those policies out is essentially for the sake of downloading that information onto employees and having them really engaged in what those definitions are. The other piece would be if if things are readily available to them and they're posted or they're in a binder, or however you display them in your office, it's important that they have access to the piece that is relevant to them. So splitting them out into three parts really creates that opportunity.
Great. And you can tell me if this is getting too far ahead, but what elements or procedures should be included in a comprehensive policy regarding this new legislation, specifically for a small children's after-school programming charity?
So I mean, look, when you say small children's charity, it's important. It feels like it should be different because you're dealing with a vulnerable sector of society. However, each workplace in Ontario is expected to be compliant, and that looks like having a policy, having a written program, and having each and every employee trained. And when you go on, say for instance, if you decided to take our training, what you would find is that you're so informed by the definitions and the practices and the execution of the compliance for this legislation that it doesn't discriminate against which type of industry you are in. It simply informs leaders and employees that are handling any kind of sensitive situation.
Okay, so it's...
Does that answer your question, Marina? Do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's great. And perhaps you could just back up a little bit, Carrie, and we've had a couple of people questioning about the second policy that you're referring to. So maybe you could just do a quick breakdown just one more time for those that need a bit of more of a refresher.
Okay. So under compliance, so to be compliant, you must have a policy. So what we've recommended is that we break that policy out into two parts to define harassment. So it now includes sexual violence and sexual harassment, which was not included before. So we've recommended we break those two out, so harassment and sexual violence and sexual harassment, because it's important to, by definition, to understand the difference, but then also to have access to the relevant piece of the policy, so that you can feel like you understand entirely what your incident looks like, what you do to report it, and that would be all laid out in your policy.
Great. And you mentioned template policies. Do you have any suggestions on where people can access those, or is it even good to use them at all?
That's a great question. So this is where the rubber hits the road for us. Again, I mentioned out in the outset of this call that this is a labor of love for us, and part of that is making sure that anyone that we come into contact with as a business, including those of you on the call today, understands that the written program really is the execution of this legislation in the space of compliance. And piecemealing or putting things together ourselves, hoping for the best, is such a liability. And the only time you're going to find out that your written program or your policies aren't compliant is when the Ministry of Labour comes in and does an audit, which surprisingly enough, we've had a few clients call us saying, oh no, they've called, they're coming. We need to make sure, and they even though they've done what they believe is dotting I's and crossing T's, they're very, very nervous because it's not certain. So we have a written program, Marina, that we've put together with healthcare professionals, psychologists, legal minds, and it is an out-of-the-box compliant written program that allows people to use fillable forms in a soft copy and also a desk reference that is an absolute step-by-step guide down to the tone of voice to use, the way that you would investigate, what to do after. So you're really guided by professionals in this manual, even though you're not being coached personally by these people in the room.
Great. Okay, and I see we've got questions starting to roll in here, so thank you everybody, and I just want to remind you, you can type your questions into the chat box and we'll do our best to get them answered. So moving on, a question from Lena. Does this policy pertain only to sexual violence and harassment, or is it also other types based on religion, political views, etc.?
That's another amazing question. So any kind of discrimination is considered harassment. So again, I take us back to how do we determine whether harassment has taken place? Well, it is a pattern of behaviors. It could be one drastic experience, but it is in the experience of the person receiving the harassment. And under the law, it is outlined that no one should need to comments based on anything to do with sex, sexual orientation, creed, etc. So absolutely, to our audience's point, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, so I apologize. The harassment is not just sexual harassment; it's absolutely to do with the discriminatory factors as well.
Great. And a question from Juliet. Is it still considered in compliance if the organization is working on the written program? So right now they've got that sort of in progress. Is that okay for now, or do they need to hurry up and get that done ASAP?
So what I've said to people and what I know is that the Ministry of Labour has hired investigators because it's now an occupational health and safety issue as well. They've hired extra investigators, and they are performing spot checks without formal complaints on file. So here's the analogy hopefully everyone can relate to. If you're not compliant, fully compliant today, you are driving your car without insurance. So if an incident comes up, you will experience liability.
Okay, great. So it's less about an absolute date and more about the fact that,
Marina, just so you know, you're cutting out, so a little bit.
Okay, I think we're having a little bit of go-to glitches today. So I noticed a few people mentioned that we've got a bit of cutting out. So we're just going to keep going and hope that that works itself out. Sometimes it's a bit of an internet issue as well. So
great.
Great. Okay, so Carrie, can you explain what's involved in the written program versus the policy?
Okay, so that actually takes me to my next point. It's a great segue. So Marina, I'm going to ask you to hold that question for just a second as I move on, and then I'm going to, that'll be the first question I get to. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome. So the next part of the legislation that we need to be compliant around is the written program. And this is really my favorite piece of the legislation because it gives people such a breadth of knowledge and experience, and especially tools and resources to actually start implementing psychological safety in the workplace. So previously under Bill 168, a policy was enough. It was enough. So essentially the practice looked like, devising a policy and putting it on the wall and making sure everybody can see it. And we all know that does not shift behavior. So I like the direction the legislation is going in. Bill 132 states a policy is not enough. So an employer shall, in consultation with the committee or health and safety representative, if any, develop and maintain a program to implement the policy with respect to the workplace harassment. So the written program requirements is where we're finding the greatest confusion and organizational stress. So responses range from we'll just do it ourselves to we're getting our lawyers to handle this to we'll ignore this part and cross our fingers and hope for the best. So we've had a number of companies receive the spot checks, as I said, and the written program must be very comprehensive and address a number of factors. So essentially the legislation says this: set out how incidents or complaints of how workplace harassment will be investigated and dealt with. So essentially, just to recap, this program should include a thorough, sensitive, and psychologically sound approach to investigating and to ensure your organization is overcoming barriers to reporting and addressing harassment issues basically appropriately. So Marina, I'm going to go back to you now for that question. So can you repeat the question, and I'm happy to answer that for you.
Oh, certainly. And Carrie, perhaps you could just repeat yourself just briefly. You cut out for a few minutes there. So could you just go back a slide and cover that one more time?
Absolutely. So we'll be back to here?
Yes.
Okay. So excellent. So the Bill 132, so under Bill 168, a policy was not enough. And that was previous to Bill 132. And Bill 132 is an amendment to Bill 168. So now a policy is not enough. And it states that an employer shall, in consultation with the committee or health and safety representative, if any, develop and maintain a program to implement the policy with respect to workplace harassment. So the legislation essentially says, set out how incidents or complaints of workplace harassment will be investigated and dealt with. So just to recap that quickly for you, Marina, this program should include a thorough, sensitive, and psychologically sound approach to investigating and processing complaints to ensure your organization is overcoming barriers to reporting. And that's really what the written program is all about. And it's woven through this entire legislation is to sort of break the power differential and restore balance, and also give people access to reporting in a confidential and safe way.
Excellent. And that, perhaps you can expand on that a little bit. That was the question. How do you explain what is involved in the written program versus the policy?
Okay. So the policy is essentially, what you're going to do, what has to happen, and the written program is really how you execute that. So you would have investigative procedures. So you would actually show this is what we're going to do an investigation specifically. This is our process essentially. The written program is showing that not only are you, you're showing zero tolerance via your policies, but you've implemented a process to handle any serious complaints or any complaints at all. So really when you distill down what is the written program versus the policy is your zero tolerance disclaimer, and then your written program is activating your process for the legislation compliance.
Great. Now, here's an interesting question from Lisa. We have a lot of staff that are minors. If a minor reports an issue of workplace sexual harassment to us, do we have extra requirement to report to the parents or to report criminally?
So that's when you know, that's even out of my breadth, because that's when, you know, we have Dr. Bond on staff, and lucky for us, she has, you know, like a strong sense of the duty to report. So in these situations, when it comes to minors, I think, you know, your common sense factor also has to kick in here. So, you know, if it was your child and that happened, would you want the parents to know? Absolutely. And if you're in a position of power as an employer, it's really important to take seriously the duty to report. So my answer to that would be yes, you would have a duty to report that, and then also activate any of your internal processes that you have to protect that person with your you know, compliance to the legislation.
Right. Sounds
But
like
it's always better in that situation to over-report versus under-report, because I mean, you just want to take the child, make sure the minor is kept safe and that they're advocated for. That is the main thing, and that the company and the organization is also doing their duty to make sure that nobody else is exposed to that.
excellent. And another question from Robin. We have, our organization has required all employees and board members who are volunteers to receive the training, but I'm starting to get pushback from volunteers on the board as they feel this does not apply to them. Any advice on how to get them involved?
Excellent question. I was hoping that the board would come up, because, you know, you're not alone. It's been a common question, phrased many different ways. And here's the way that, you know, the legislation suggests a worker is required, and that would be a paid worker. Again, when we move this from compliance to investigation to litigation, which those three things are possible if you look at John Gomeshi, if you look at Lori DuPont, if you look at any people in our recent history who've experienced radical harassment, and it went to a litigative stage, the holes that were poked in the process were significant. Like the CBC was compliant. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but they got raked over the coals, and there's a ton of people who lost their jobs. There's all kinds of mayhem as a result of the tolerance that was in the workplace for this person to act out, but then also their process for handling it was not sound, even though they were compliant. So my answer to the question is this: if you have anyone who's interacting with anyone to do with employees and it has an impact on your culture at work, my suggestion would be a judge would say for $15 or, you know, whatever it costs to take the training, it's unreasonable that you wouldn't step in and want to do that as a way of influencing culture in a positive way. So the board members, if anything is possible to blow back on the organization, it would be, you know, it would be a reasonable effort for the board members to engage in this training. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
I think so. And we had a second question on that about whether board members should receive the training in harassment, and is it a requirement? And it sounds like you're recommending that it's a good idea to do that.
Yeah, again, the difference between requirement and recommendation is all about compliance and then shifting your culture. So is it required? No, it's not. Is it recommended? Absolutely. And I guess we're only going to find out if it's required, again, if an incident gets serious enough that it goes to a litigative stage. And, you know, it's just a big question mark around why didn't those board members partake? What was the source of their resistance? So it's just, it sounds a bit like fear-mongering, and that's certainly not how I want to come across. I just want to make sure people know how important it is to be united in this effort, and make sure that anyone who's coming into contact with the organization is trained.
Great. Now, I have a question from Rhonda. I understand that Bill 132, there is less confidentiality than with Bill 168. The complainant is entitled to be updated as to what has been done or for the person they complained about. Is this true?
So there's, you know, I guess what we've had is a balance of, so if there is a false claim against someone, you know, we have a culture, a democracy, and, you know, an era of you are innocent until proven guilty. And there is, you know, now a protective layer for the person who's being accused. So that's why the investigative process is so important to be sound within your organization, because just because you don't see it as a leader or somebody who's managing any kind of first-line response to these complaints. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And just because somebody said it happened doesn't mean it happened, because there's interpretation at times. So if you're reasonably managing an employee who's feeling a bit uncomfortable because they haven't been doing their job, they claim harassment. It's unreasonable to think that performance management would be interpreted as harassment, but it's a really easy way to get out of being held accountable for your work. So these things are happening in the workplace. So to answer your question, there is updates, but that is not a requirement from the person who's been victimized. If they have been victimized, that's something that would be spit out into the HR process or the third-party investigative process. So it still shields the victim from having any more re-victimization. It still gives them that layer of opaque, really, between them and the person who they've accused.
Okay, and this is another great question. What happens when it's a small agency and the harassment is coming from the executive director? What steps do you recommend taking?
So that's often the case. So the reason we're here is because that's the case. So, in an overwhelming number of cases, it is the direct supervisor who is responsible, and sometimes even the CEO. So there needs to be, by law now, part of this legislation is that there needs to be another person who is not the direct supervisor of the employees, that is trained as a frontline responder and who can manage with confidentiality this process. So that's really, this is the amazing direction that that this legislation is moving in. It's not to the point, we have what's called a HEART team, and you see that on the screen. It's called Harassment Education Advisory Response Team. Now we take this into organizations and it becomes a peer support group, and people are trained on the front line and have the same sort of code of confidentiality as you would as an HR professional. And you're trained in how to handle these complaints, and therefore the person who is doing the complaining, who's making the complaint, is first of all, the barrier to reporting is reduced because they don't have to consider that it's their supervisor. They can go to a peer, and that's really where the law went. The challenge is, in a small organization, you probably only have one other person that you can use instead of implementing a team, in which case you would make that complaint to that person. So you're protected by this legislation in that you have to have a second person trained.
Okay, and just expanding on that a little bit, a question from Marcy. Do you recommend having an external investigator as part of the process for investigating complaints? And if so, do you have any suggestions on how to find such an investigator?
So, we're a good third-party investigator where we have, we're credentialed to do that. There's, I think there could be a mandated third party. That's part of the legislation as well, depending on how escalated it does get. It's always good to have impartial people involved in this. And what I would suggest is, if it's a reasonable committee that you can put together, is have talk to us about the advisory team and how that works, and put a peer group in place. The reason you don't want to constantly default to a third party is because really some of these things are manageable internally, and sometimes people don't realize. We've in fact had an overwhelming number of cases where bosses are accused of harassment, or direct supervisors, and they're so unaware of how their communication style impacts the people below them. They often are a little more aggressive with people below them, and sort of bright and shiny to their reports. So I would suggest the first line would be to have your own peer support team put in place, and then the Ministry of Labor would be your best resource, or ourselves here at BizLife, to engage in a third-party investigator.
So you're saying, Carrie, in a lot of cases, education, it can be actually quite helpful, and it doesn't need to necessarily move on to investigation?
That's true. I mean, again, we don't want to diminish the experience of anyone who gets harassed, because I am in no position to determine how serious that is for that person. However, the manual that we have really helps identify, to the point of oversimplifying the process, and really providing the tools and giving those benchmarks and those markers when it's time to engage a third party, So instead of, you starting from 0 and going to 60, you can start from 0 and go through the steps chronologically, because that keeps it fair for everybody. So if there's a false claim of harassment and we go to a third-party investigator, it becomes a big thing. I don't know how fair that is. If it's a legitimate complaint and it goes to a third-party investigator, I guess we don't complain about that because you have the proper advocacy. With the manual and with the consultation of somebody like our company, who is, we've spent decades really here, we can really help in that situation, so you're not making sort of great leaps when you only need to take a small step.
Okay, and back to what you were saying before about having a second person, if you're in a small agency, you might only have one other person that, can be part of your peer support. Could that person be a board member?
That is an interesting question. I guess that is a matter of, there's no reason why not. I guess when you choose to have somebody in this role, so there's certainly, you don't want somebody who has a history of being a bully. You don't want to have somebody who's not already an informal leader in the organization. In other words, they're well liked and they're well trusted. So there's certain criteria that I would put before worrying about whether they were a board member or not, but there's no reason why you can't have part of the board on the peer support team.
Great. And how do these laws apply if it's actually a donor or a community member or a client maybe who is feeling harassed by someone within the organization? Do the same rules apply in that case? So
the compliance piece for this legislation strictly relates to the organization itself. And does not include external communication. So there is a sense of mobile workplace, definitely. So if we're at an office party or we're out at an event and this happens, then that's a different story. However, the legislation is individual businesses that are residing in Ontario, and it does not include clients or donors.
Great. And what if, the harassment might be coming from a volunteer who's not a paid employee? Do the laws still apply then?
So the compliance piece, it depends on whether you've trained your volunteers. Again, that's an incident. It might be a sticky type of situation in terms of proving that yes, we're liable for this. It might be sticky proving you're not liable. So it's one of those situations where, again, err on the side of caution. Make sure all of your volunteers are trained. And then what you've done is you've shown as an organization, and I hate to sound like we're checking boxes here, but really this is one of those boxes that should be checked. You're showing that you have done everything reasonable. You can't predict everything. Everything reasonable to show that you are compliant in this legislation. And by allowing people who are volunteers to interact with staff and interact with board members and then of course face the public, having not had this training it might be seen as irresponsible. It just has not been included in the law yet. My guess is that's where the legislation is going. So legally, according to the legislation, the Ministry of Labour today, the volunteers are excluded.
Okay. And how does this bill apply if there is an incident at an event that's either happening outside of workplace hours or off-site? So say there's a Christmas party or an educational event or something like that. How does the bill still apply then?
Absolutely, especially if it's, again, if we've extended the geography of our work environment, it absolutely does apply.
Okay, and do you have any information about how it might apply online? So social media, things like that. Does the bill apply?
So once again, it's all seen as, so if you can imagine, anywhere you're conducting business, you are, a lot of people's contracts, for instance, would include, how you represent the company. If you're at a soccer game and you're acting inappropriately and you are a face of, a large company in Canada, that there would be repercussions. So the legislation would include any work events. So if you're putting on an event that's social or educational and you've invited everybody through the work email and it's sort of understood that people need to go, then absolutely the legislation would apply.
Great. Okay, so I think we could probably move on to your next segment, Carrie.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I just catch up to myself here. Okay. So the last part that we were going to touch on is the training. So this is exciting because it gives everybody an opportunity to really sit with the information. So we must train all employees and leaders for Bill 132 with tracking and reporting. Okay. And so we also recommend training board members. We've just talked about that, and volunteers. And senior leaders, and the reason too, and this sort of ties back to what we were just talking about, senior leaders are now held more responsible for their behavior under Bill 132. And that's why we recommend that the board members and the volunteers and senior leaders are actually trained. So, so if you have any questions regarding the employee and leader training, and the difference is leader training, and this is really by discretion in your organization. So, you know, if you're managing people, if you're, you know, sort of an informal leader in your organization, chances are you would take the leader training. And then if you're somebody who's really task-oriented, then you would stick more to the employee. As a leader, it's really important to understand, we often say to people, take both, because it's only a half an hour each. And the leader training really talks about the added responsibilities as a leader. And then if you take the employee training, at least then you're seeing what the employees are seeing, and also you are essentially an employee as well. So it's broken out into two, and there are different responsibilities. So I'm just going to go ahead and set it out for questions. So does anyone have questions on the employee training piece?
We have a question from Norm asking if the training is online.
Hi, Norm. Thank you. So yes, the training is online. For us, we have an institute full of courses for compliance, and we do the online e-learning module. It takes 20 minutes. It's very easy to log into, and you know, we're in the process of training hundreds of organizations. So the other piece I wanted to put out there too is, if you haven't done it, it's really like the clock is ticking. But don't fret, because it's not difficult to roll out.
Great, and we've had a couple of questions about volunteers and the training that they receive. As you know, a lot of nonprofits have one-time volunteers. They may come for an event sporadically. They might come to help out, you know, serve meals or things like that. Should all of these volunteers be getting the same training, you know, or is there allowance for that?
So again, the volunteers are not mandatory. It's such a sticky. It's really difficult because as a value, you know, we know the legislation is going to go there, and what I worry about most is if that volunteer. So I know that if I volunteer for my son's basketball team, I'm vetted first. Like, I have to go through a process. It's, to me, part of that process where you would train anyone who's going to touch your organization on harassment in the workplace. I'm not sure if those one-time volunteers have been vetted previously and they're pulled from a pool of people, or if they're just sort of showing up. It's really your appetite for, you know, is it potentially going to blow back on your organization if something happens? And, you know, we've watched as these things have unfolded in the past, and there are incidents where volunteers have committed harassment or been recipients of harassment, and, you know, the liability is still there. So, you know, the answer is they're not, under this legislation, required to do the training. This would be a discretionary call from the organization.
Great. And we have a question from Art regarding the certification of trainers. Does this mean that I can't learn about it myself and then in turn train my staff?
So the training has to meet ministry standards. That's the easiest way to put it. And there's no train the trainer type of situation coming from the Ministry of Labor. So that's my understanding.
Great. And is there training available in French?
So we're in the process of actually getting ours translated. So if there's people out there that do require the French version, reach out to me after. I think my contact information is up there on the, yes it is. So if you required French, then we can chat about that offline. Absolutely.
Right. And Carrie, this might be outside of the scope of your knowledge, but Leanne is asking if you're aware if there is similar legislature in BC.
Oh, hi, Leanne. Okay, so my understanding, so no, there isn't. I'm sure there is policies. There is sort of a federal regulation versus a provincial. However, I believe that this will follow. So just as we're moving forward with amendments to the 168 because of sort of what we've learned from our experience in investigating and reporting, and then the punitive side of that has returned some gaps in the legislation and people are not feeling like they're supported enough. So this is likely going to catch on to other provinces. We're hoping it will. So as it stands to this day, I don't know necessarily about BC, but I know there's talk about this going federal.
Okay. And one last question about the training itself. Does the leader training include the process for investigation?
Absolutely. Like it will go through the requirements for investigation.
Great.
But where you're really going to get that information is from the HART manual, from the written program.
Okay. Excellent. All right. I think we could move along, Carrie.
Okay. So that wrapped up the 3 levels. So, essentially, we're in partnership with Charity Village, as you guys know, and we've provided this mandatory training to a lot of not-for-profits. Happily, we reduced our price in terms of the written program to, align with the budgets and just, as an act of goodwill for the not-for-profits. At this point, Marina, I would like to open it up to general questions, which means general questions about any of the 3 topics we've covered. So that would be policies, written program or training, but also harassment in general. So if we have any lingering questions, now would be the time to address them.
Fantastic. Okay, so we have to start off a question from Karamat. We have recently revised our policies with regards to violence and harassment. All of the recommendations of Bill 132 have been kept, but the policy manual does address both issues under one. My question is, should we have kept the violence and harassment as separate policies?
Again, it's the compliance piece would suggest you can have one policy for the purpose of engagement and the purpose of serving your employees well and providing the relevant information that they need and ease of understanding. I would split them out into 2.
Okay, and I know we sort of briefly covered this, Carrie, but we're still getting a lot of questions about how this applies to volunteers, volunteers who are volunteering for a specific period of time, co-op students, interns, week-long youth volunteers, basically non-staff. Maybe you could just cover that one more time.
No problem. I'm happy to. And I think that this is, the overwhelming question that we've received here is around the volunteers. I mean, every single organization that we've had the pleasure of working with is so concerned about this, and that's why we know the legislation's moving in this direction. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to err on the side of caution. The fact that we're questioning whether we should or we shouldn't should tell you that it's bound to be a problem. So again, how much security do you want to put around your organization? How protective do you want to be of your staff? So if you're, when you think about it from the moral standpoint, we have an obligation to protect the people. And as you bring people in, there's always the opportunity for, something to get missed in the process of vetting them. There's something, so my advice from where I stand, having spent a lot of time and certainly had the information from Dr. Bott and Donna Marshall downloaded to me, is err on the side of caution. It's not expensive. I know that's relative, and I understand that the budgets are very constricted in the not-for-profit. So notwithstanding that, it is so vital to make sure that everybody who comes into contact is trained. And that comes down to, and the one thing I will point, I'm just going to put this out there, Marina, we're really good resources, and it's not a sales pitch. Like, I'm happy to chat with people about how you might approach your board to get approval for such stuff. We've really gone through that over and over again. So even if it's not, us providing training or the written program, which we would love to do, I'm happy to have a 10-minute chat with somebody around, how can we help you word your approach to go and get approval for this type of thing? Because it is, I think it's concerning anyone who's handling this portfolio in any organization.
Wonderful, and I certainly know that all of you at BizLife are just full of information on this topic, so I would encourage anyone to reach out if you have further questions, because these folks know what they're talking about. So moving on, training only has to take place once with each employee, or is this a yearly commitment?
Excellent question. So it happens once. And then the policies need to be revisited year on year. So the responsibility of the organization is to make sure that the policies are reviewed. And then if you're, let's say, for instance, if we're doing business, any updates to the legislation, we would communicate that, but the employees only need to be trained the one time.
Okay, great. And just to reiterate this, your training does meet the legislative requirements for training?
Absolutely. So the standards are set out by the Ministry of Labor, and our training, and in fact the PHSHA, they chose to use our training instead of building their own. So yes, they have their own final product, but it's informed by our ideas and our courses, because we've really been knighted as the gold standard of training. And I think the reason that is, Marina, and I'm very proud of this, because we again, it's engaging training. First of all, it's not boring. I mean, it's boring training, let's face it, but it's not boring, it's engaging. So, not everybody is so excited to go do their harassment training. So we've taken it to the step of, making it engaging for our audience. The second piece is, again, we care about how this impacts a culture. So you're actually getting, more information that helps you impact your culture and makes you a better employee or makes you a better leader. And I think, who wouldn't want to show up the next day sort of a better version of themselves? So that's really where we're coming from.
That's wonderful. Let's move on to some general questions, get back to some of the ones that we've missed during the 45 minutes today. So let's look at investigation. Can you suggest, are there sort of 1, 2, 3 steps to take when there is a harassment concern or a complaint made?
So the steps would be to have your written program. So I wouldn't go through the steps on how to investigate, because that's going to be dependent entirely on the incident itself. However, what I would suggest is that everybody have a sound written program that has that process outlined, and it's really, really important that people get access to that information. So again, in the HART manual, we have those forms for you that really you could plug anyone into the situation of investigating, and those forms would get you through it from a place of psychological safety and compliance.
Good. And is there a timeline for investigation?
What would be considered reasonable? So, the process gets activated with the complaint, and it is absolutely the responsibility of the person who is, set up to receive those complaints, that they act quickly. There are no specific time constraints around when, but there is that term reasonable that is so ingrained in our law, and it would just have to be in a reasonable frame of time. Okay.
Now, when we're talking about harassment complaints, would anything be done differently if the complaint is actually a supervisor who's feeling harassed by an employee?
That's such a good question. Oh, that's amazing. Great question. No. Just in a word, no, but it's, it's an interesting, I love these out-of-the-box questions because we're not thinking about it. And, the overwhelming experience is that women are harassed by men. And a lot of times the question doesn't get raised, does it change if women are harassing men? And I like that we're thinking about the potential of an employee harassing a boss. Now, the power differential would suggest that doesn't happen very often, but if it does, again, because the legislation is framed the way it is, compliance is only achieved when you have not only, say, an HR person or a senior supervisor, but somebody else trained. So there's always going to be that other person who is not involved in a supervisory role that you can go to. So it does not change the process. It just obviously changes the dynamic.
Okay. And how does this affect workplace bullying? Could you maybe touch on that topic a little bit?
Absolutely. So workplace bullying is alive and well. I mean, the statistics are like half, or sorry, I think it's around 65%, don't quote me, around how many people who've experienced workplace harassment. And that's really another name for bullying. So bullying can look like, isolating people, not including them in meetings. It can look like overt exclusion. It could look like just, speaking inappropriately, constantly shunning them. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can be bullying. And once again, this really is determined by the experience of the person experiencing the bullying. So it's that person's interpretation of another person's actions that really decides whether the complaint is legitimate.
Okay. And could you just cover one more time what happens if it's actually a contractor or a person from outside your organization but who's working with your organization who makes a complaint? Do the same rules apply?
So they don't, unfortunately. So, that's another area where the law is very, very weak right now. So, your liability as an organization is to make sure your employees are trained and that your process is meant to serve your internal organization, not a contractor or somebody who's working with your organization.
So I assume the opposite is true as well then? So if you're working for an organization and experiencing harassment from a contractor or from another organization, again, rules don't apply?
The rules don't apply, but I guess if I could plug my advice in that scenario, I will. So everyone in Ontario, especially if it's in Ontario, everyone is required to be trained. Everyone is required to have policies. So my first reaction to that is that you would make contact with the owner or contact with somebody senior in that organization to make them aware that this is happening.
Good. Now we have a few more questions about the online training before we wrap up today. So Hanan was wondering what's required to do the online training. For example, does the organization need to have a computer for each person, or could the board do the entire training together?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. So you can, one of many ways. So you could do it in a boardroom. It doesn't change the price, but it certainly changes the delivery. So you could do it sort of. The challenge with that is that everyone will need to individually access it because there are quizzes that everyone has to take in order to receive the certification. So no, you don't have to have your own computer, but maybe access to a computer because you will have a unique login. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. That's great. And here's another great question. Can you talk about some of the consequences for organizations that don't comply?
Excellent question. That's such a great question. So they're endless. I mean, from having formal complaints, being audited by the Ministry of Labor, by the investigators, to being fined. Some companies up to or organizations up to $500,000 for non-compliance. They have a responsibility. And so the reason that this is becoming so punitive is because it's gone from just being a human rights issue to being an Ontario health and safety issue as well. So now they have more people on the ground to enforce it. And again, Kathleen Wynne has indicated this is zero tolerance. This is her platform. And so she's working really hard to make sure that stuff gets implemented. So it's, there's fines, there's financial fines, attrition of your employees. There's tons of, sort of those soft things that can happen as a result. And then, the slap on the wrist from the Ministry of Labor. So it's really, and then also if it goes to a litigation stage, if you're in a situation where, you've gone to a judge and you're not compliant, I mean, there is no telling now the damages that could be awarded to somebody who makes a claim against your company or your organization. So it's really, really vital that everybody takes seriously not just the compliance piece, but what it represents in that you're producing a zero tolerance for harassment, and you're showing good faith by making sure that you're compliant and doing everything reasonable to do so.
And a question from Olivia. Does the BizLife training help shape the written policy, or should we have our policy outlined before we move forward with the training?
So the written program actually has the policy templates in it, which means that you're not reinventing the wheel or driving yourself crazy to try to pull together a policy that maybe you're not so sure about. The policy templates are included in the written program, so that's, to me, the path of least resistance and the peace of mind that I would want if I was doing this, especially if I don't have a massive HR back office. But right now, at the very least, everyone should have a policy in place. I mean, it's really, really risky if you're at a stage where you don't even have a policy.
Okay. And Lisa is asking, I know the training for staff is one time, so when a new employee is hired, I assume he or she must be trained as well.
Yes, so the way that we've built it out with our clients is, we do the sort of bulk training of everyone. So each person gets, an email to their inbox that says, you're invited to do this training, and it is mandatory. They click on a link, they log in, they do the training. And then the relationship is set up, so as new people come on, they just call us and we set that person up. And we honor the same price for the new hires as we've honored to do this time around.
Great. Now I know we're coming up close on time here, so I think we're just going to finish with one last question, and
Okay.
perhaps you can just go over this one more time, because I think it is a little bit confusing for folks. Is external training required or just highly recommended? And can an HR person within an organization deliver the training?
So it is mandatory. You have to. So in order to achieve compliance, you have to have a policy, have a written program, and train every single employee. By definition, a paid employee under the Ministry of Labor standards. As long as the training meets the ministry requirements in the standard, then it can be delivered. And then, that sort of concludes that concept. It's risky to take on the responsibility unless, again, you have a large HR background and it's something that, you're confident is meeting the standards, because you don't know what you don't know until there's investigations. So we highly dissuade people from trying to do this because it's very inexpensive. I mean, it's $15 per person. I know, again, I'm sensitive to the relativity of expensive. However, it's really recommended that you take something that has been already determined to be ministry standard. I hope that makes sense.
Wonderful, that does. And Carrie, did you have any closing remarks before we wrap up today?
I sure do. I just want to thank everybody. This is my first time doing a webinar, so you've been an incredibly quiet but amazing audience. And so just to, hopefully everybody got the information they came for. And my invitation would be, if there are more questions, I'm not the only person in this organization, so we're sort of together the expert. I'm happy to put you on a call with Donna or ask, my senior people, if there's things that I haven't covered here. So please feel free to pick up the phone and give us a call. We have no problem having a chat and guiding you through this process. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Carrie. It was a great presentation, and I hope people are leaving today having some more of their questions answered. Before we sign off, I do want to remind everyone we'll follow up with you by email tomorrow morning with the webinar recording and the presentation slides. So if you joined late or you missed something, not to worry, you'll get that recording tomorrow. We're also going to include a link to a short survey, so if you can take a moment to fill that out, it helps us to plan our content and our delivery going forward. And you'll have an opportunity there to let us know if there's other topics that you'd like to see covered in a future session. With that, I think we're going to close. We do have another session finishing up our 2016 webinars happening on December 8th, and we'll include a link to that as well in case you want to register. And I'm super happy to announce that we have our 2017 webinars started and up on our website, so do check those out as well. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.